Everyone has a lens through which they view the world. This lens is called a worldview. When a person creates a story, it's embedded with ideas from their worldview. Know how you're being influenced. Philosophy.
Hello, my name is Caden, and this is my associate, Josh. Josh, would you care to introduce yourself?
Sure, my name's Josh. I got my degree in history a couple years ago, and today we're going to talk about movies. We're going to talk about The Watchmen.
That's right. First off, important question. Who is your favorite character of the Watchmen movie?
My favorite character is Rorschach.
I think I'd have to agree with you. He's a very complex character. I like him a lot. Throughout the movie, he's got this sort of theme, this saying that he repeats, and then ultimately at the end, it becomes really dramatic. He says, never compromise, never surrender, right? And so, given that humanity was sort of saved by the compromise of millions of lives, what do you think of that character's philosophy?
I think he understood what the other characters didn't, and that was that it doesn't matter if you make a compromise, even if it's for good. In the end, it's not gonna. Humanity is still depraved, and it's still gonna come back. And it's gonna come full circle, and human beings are gonna be back on the brink of nuclear war. It may be a while, but eventually, I think he understood that they were going to be back to that point.
It's also interesting, his journal, he had the foresight to drop it off. Like, he knew that he might not come out of it alive. And so when he went to confront Ozymandias, he was still thinking, I can't compromise, I can't surrender. And so if I can't do this, then I need to have someone else who can. And so he turns to the media.
And in the end, when the newspaper ends up publishing his journal, that will end up, I mean, the movie doesn't go that far. By them publishing that journal, that will undo everything that they worked for. So ultimately, the compromise fails. The movie just doesn't go that far.
And that's the thing, though, that I'm not sure how I feel about, because, yes, he, undid the compromise, but then that means that those people, those millions and millions of people, died for nothing, because then the compromise that they were dying for is undone, And so, I'm not sure how I feel about that, knowing that their sacrifice ultimately means nothing. What are your thoughts?
Right. Well, if you look at history, let's take a look at World War II. All right, you had the Axis powers versus the Allied powers, and who were the Allied powers? You had the U.S., you had the U.K., and you had the USSR, and a bunch of other smaller countries, but those were like the main players, right? And so they were all fighting for that common goal. They were all trying to take down the Axis powers. So by uniting the whole world against one common enemy, and that would be Dr. Manhattan, eventually they're either gonna reach that goal, or they're gonna see that Dr. Manhattan's gone, he's not coming back, and they're just gonna go back to fighting each other anyways. So it's a temporary fix. Also, I don't think they hit the nail on the head there very well, because during World War II there was conflict between the U.S., UK, USSR, and how the war should be handled. They had to have summits, and there was some tension between. And so when the newspaper editor is talking to his employee and saying, hey, everybody's just holding hands and singing Kumbaya and everything's great, I don't think that's the way it would be. Now, maybe it would be for a short time. Maybe it would be like after 9/11, everybody had this, there was this patriotic fervor. We got to stand for America. Maybe it would have been a worldwide thing, because cities all across the world were attacked. But I don't think that would have lasted very long. And you have to take into account too that looking at history again, looking at World War II, the USSR was putting itself in such a place to where it could then take over most of Europe, which they eventually did. They took over much of Europe, and it was there's a line through Germany east, and that was like the Iron Curtain. That was communist-controlled U.S. are controlled. And so through this struggle, even though they would all be fighting together, banding together, they would all recognize that eventually this conflict is going to pass, and then someone's going to have to come out on top. So there would be stuff in the background where they're trying to kind of jockey for power when the conflict is past.
Okay.
And so those are a couple of thoughts I've had about how it ended, and so that's why I think that even though the sacrifice was made and peace was achieved, I think it's going to be a temporary peace.
See that now that you say that, because you brought up 9/11, right? Everyone's singing Kumbaya, and then there's lots of energy going to go invade the Middle East, right? But in this scenario, Dr. Manhattan's gone. He left the galaxy. And so where's all that energy going to go? All the weapons they've built up, those are just going to redirect on each other, and it's going to make things worse in the end. And so I guess ultimately Ozymandias' fix isn't really a fix at all. It's just pushing it back a couple of years, maybe a couple of decades if they're lucky.
It is. Exactly, because human nature still remains the same. Human nature is still afraid, like mankind, still mankind. You can't save mankind from themselves. There was something that Wright had said towards the end, like, the comedian was right. Humanity's savage nature will eventually lead to global annihilation. Even if you push it back a little bit, it's still going to happen.
And speaking of humanity and human nature, let's turn our attention to a character who is very different from most of humanity. And of course, I'm referring to Dr. Manhattan, right? He's sort of set up as this omniscient, omnipotent God figure. One of the news reporters even calls him God in the film. And so, yet, of course, he does deny that claim, saying that he's not God, and if he was God, he wouldn't be anything like him. But it brings up the question of what this movie is trying to say about God, about something so close to humanity, and yet very different. What are your thoughts here?
Dr. Manhattan, he's a complicated character. I haven't been able to kind of fully get a grasp on his character. I thought it was interesting. His character, he's not
very clothed.
He's a very cold guy. He's a very emotionless. I know that the villain ends up saying that I can see the faint twitches in his face, and like he was had it been a regular human being, they would have been up there bawling, just crying their eyes out. But he's void of emotion. I thought it was interesting, a few of the things that he said. He said, perhaps the world is not made. Perhaps nothing is made. A clock without a craftsman.
Yeah, I guess it's kind of at one point you set up this God character. But then he says, so he's got this authority and this recognition as being someone very intelligent. And then that God figure proclaims there is no God. It all happens by chance. Right? And then on top of that, this God figure is acting very cold and emotionless and uncaring about death and humanity. And so I guess the film is kind of saying God, if he did exist, is cold, emotionless, and doesn't care about us. Or that he doesn't exist at all. Which makes sense given the very, very dark tones in the movie.
And then at the end, he goes and he says about how he's thinking about maybe going somewhere else to create life, like almost becoming the god of his own world that he's going to create, and becoming that cold and uncaring God figure. That's what he would be in that world.
And I did notice that, whenever he dies, and then whenever, like the first time, whenever he's human, and then he becomes Dr. Manhattan, and then whenever he's Dr. Manhattan and Ozymandias, does the electricity thingy, it's very much a crucifixion stance, right? Which just further reinforces the idea that he is that sort of figure. Now, he mentioned, Dr. Manhattan, that all events are preordained. Now, whether or not you believe in God, it does bring up the question of, how much say do we have in our lives? Are we just slaves to biology and the society that we are raised in? Or do we actually have a choice in who we are? And if we actually have a choice, why don't we see more of a varied set of beliefs and actions? nobody acts like a 19th century peasant, right? Although
Right.
theoretically they could take on those beliefs and attitudes if they wanted to, nobody does.
Mm-hmm.
And so how much say do we actually have in who we are and what happens to us? Some people are on the scale of like, yeah, karma. If you put good energy out, good energy will come back in. And then some people are like, it's all random.
Mm-hmm.
You're a slave to your biological functions. And so I don't think either of those two extremes are right. But where do we draw the line?
That's a good question. I think Rorschach, he errs toward the side of, and humanity is hopeless. And it really comes out in his journal, especially his first entry. He's just like, the streets are extended gutters, and the gutters are full of blood. And when the drains finally scab over, the vermin will drown. He talks about humanity as vermin and cockroaches and whores, and just the accumulated filth of everything. His opinion of humanity is incredibly low. He tends to think that there's really no way that humanity can ever rise above that. Humanity doesn't really have the choice. Like they're almost doomed to being down in that gutter. Like leave humanity alone to its own devices, and they're going to go to that gutter, and that's where they're going to stay.
And it's interesting to note that every single character, despite all of their different ideologies, Dr. Manhattan thinks the same thing to the point where he leaves the galaxy. Even Ozymandias thinks that same thing. That's why he set up this whole plan, right? And he mentions that a couple of times. And so that idea is very much one that this movie is pushing. And given how corrupt humans are, this movie doesn't really offer a solution to that corruption. Most movies, they either end on a feel-good note, yeah, things will get better, we're going to keep going, or they've got the main characters at least find a way to be happy and prosperous. But this one, it just kind of ends on the note, yeah, there's going to be more bloodshed and violence, humanity's evil and doomed. And so it's a very hopeless and dark movie, given in its storyline. And so that brings up the question, do we even have hope as humanity, right? Is there any way for us to prevent all this violence and bloodshed from just continually cycling? What are your thoughts?
Yeah, I agree. I think it's a very hopeless movie. The way it ends, you know that it's going to go straight back to warfare, especially it's not even going to take very much time because they're publishing Rorschach's journal. And so it's going to happen right away. You know that as soon as the credits are rolling, nukes are going to start flying.
Right.
So you're right. It's a very hopeless movie. And the movie makers don't give you a good solution to it.
Well, on that note, I think we're going to cut the recording. So thank you very much for joining Josh and I as we look at Watchmen.
Thank you for watching this video. Please consider subscribing or liking. Visit the discussion page on our channel to leave a comment about movies or philosophy. I'll see you in the next video.